if we see the locus of regionalism and regionalization is actually happening within the same cluster of countries within the same region. So it's actually based on the region, as the name suggests, regionalism and regionalization. Now, in the case study, I'm going to highlight several preview that is taken from my book, Tree Strategy, Initiation from Regionalization to Regionalism. So, with regards to ASEAN now is actually becoming, one of the best performers, in the world. Yeah. So, aside from China, we have the emerging markets is also coming from ASEAN. So, as Evans previously argued in 2011, that putting your money into emerging markets now is no longer a risky strategy. So because in fact many have more solid foundations than their Western counterparts. So if you remember the financial crisis, the global financial crisis in 2008, so it is actually becoming a new era. So it is actually a threshold. This is actually a gate for the new era in Asia, especially in emerging markets in Asia. Because when the Western markets is actually quite struggling, the emerging markets, although it is quite impacted also by the global financial crisis, but it is becoming more and more relevant in today's economy, especially China. And when it comes to ASEAN is also becoming one of the most important hub in the world. So with ASEAN as mentioned, it is actually also important to see what Indonesia is capable of, because what actually construct ASEAN is actually most of ASEAN is quite very much constructed by Indonesia, because Indonesia is one of the biggest, the biggest country in ASEAN and one of the biggest in the world in terms of GDP. So we are number 16 in terms of GDP, and there is actually become a major qualification of us becoming in the G20 meeting. So this is actually our fundamentals. So ASEAN, Asia is now becoming becoming a next important thing. It is best to see, if you want to see actually the relation among ASEAN countries, we need to see it from the intra-regional trade share. So when it comes to intra-regional trade share, ASEAN alone is actually going nowhere. So if you see it, starting from 1967, so since the first establishment of ASEAN countries, until today, the inter-regional trade shares, around 25%. So what is actually inter-regional trade share? Inter-regional trade share, when I mention inter-regional trade share, ASEAN inter-regional trade share is actually trade that is actually happening between ASEAN countries. So we call it the intra-regional trade share. So inter-regional trade share, when you see the data, is actually not that encouraging. The inter-regional trade share of ASEAN, as I mentioned before, is around 25%. Actually, in 2011, the late Surin Pitsuwan, former General Secretary of ASEAN, at that time when I had a teleconference meeting back in Tokyo, and we had some discussion on having the ASEAN 2015 ASEAN Economic Community. So at that time, the goal is to have a minimum 30% of intra-regional trade share. So although it is quite modest, 30%, but it is not achievable. So now we're already in 2020, so the inter-regional trade share alone is actually not that encouraging. As I said before, it's around 25%. Why is it not that encouraging? But because if we compare it with the inter-regional trade share that is happening within the European Union, that is serving as the basis of regional trading agreement, or the single market, or maybe a regional trade agreement or regional trade integration. If you see it from the European Union have more or less 70% of the inter-regional trade share. So 25% is quite lagging behind. So, but if you actually put the coverage into the ASEAN plus 3, for example, that is also including Japan, China, and also Korea, the figure is quite promising. We have more or less 60% of interregional trade share happening within this ASEAN plus 3. So how to make it in reality? Because now ASEAN plus 3 is still not happening. It's still not in reality. The problem is when it comes to China, Japan, Korea, they have their own perspective on having this ASEAN plus 3 agreement, or the ASEAN, we call it the ASEAN plus 3. This is more to Japanese-China relationship, which is actually not that encouraging, because Japan-China has a bad history of war and post-World War that is actually becoming a major obstacle of having the ASEAN plus 3. Although through some simulation, if we have this China, Japan, Korea trade agreement happening, this is actually can create the spillover effect also to ASEAN countries. So for my several paper, my empirical paper suggests that this can be happening if China, Japan, and Korea is entering ASEAN with their FTA scheme. Actually, if you compare before the Asian financial crisis and the post-Asian financial crisis, we have more or less different phenomena. First, in the early 1990s, when it comes to East Asian Economic Caucus, that is actually first mentioned by the Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, Japan is the one that is the first to reject this idea because of the we have this the U.S. domination over Japan. But after the great financial crisis in 1998, when China is entering ASEAN with some FTA strategy, Japan is seeing this as a threat for their market. So they also enter the Asian market through FTA, although they have their FTA strategy quite unilaterally. So Japan is having ASEAN FTA and also Indonesia EPA. China is also entering ASEAN with their own FTA, with also the Koreans also doing the same thing. Although they don't have their own FTA, they don't have their own trilateral FTA between China, Japan, and Korea. But this is also serving as a potential basis and as a good fundamentals for creating the next regional trade agreement, the next regionalism that is actually happening in ASEAN. In terms of regionalization, actually Japan, China, and Korea is quite very much overwhelmed with this regionalization process, because when you see their trade relationship is actually quite dominant. But again, this is a market-driven process. This won't be sustainable. So my hypothesis is to have a more institution-driven process that serves just like in the EU. So again, when you see this figure, when you see this feature of Japan, China, and also Korea making their own FTA to ASEAN countries, this is actually quite interesting facts, and this is according to my simulation. This will create this regional-wide FTA. How can it be? So when China is entering ASEAN with their own FTA, this will trigger the Japanese also to enter the ASEAN market. So you see from my paper, China, Japan, Korea strategy towards the ASEAN market using the game theoretical model. This China, Japan, and Korea entering ASEAN market will actually give you the best payoff, which is called the Nash equilibrium. So when China is entering the ASEAN market, most likely Japan will follow. And China, according to the payoff matrix, China is also actually very much related with what the Japanese will do and have done before, because Japanese has more a comprehensive strategy towards the ASEAN markets. With that in mind, if Japan is not doing FTA just like China is doing right now, most likely the payoff even for China will be quite negative. So in order to have the best payoff, the national equilibrium will be China, Japan, Korea entering the ASEAN market. So this will create equilibrium in the future that will serve as the basis of the ASEAN plus 3 figure. ASEAN plus 3 is one of the alternative. Another thing is the RCEP, which is ASEAN plus 6, that includes the India, also Australia, and New Zealand. So we have the more the merrier when it comes to trade strategy, when it comes to regionalism. I think the more countries included is actually better for the group growth for the regional growth. So what is the way forward? How we can gain from trade, how we can gain from regionalism, how we can achieve regionalism. So it's not the EU-like process. So ASEAN is actually quite different. We have a more heterogeneous environment as opposed to EU, which is quite homogeneous. So when it comes to homogeneous environment, it's actually quite feasible if you have this the normal trade stages into regionalism. We have this FTA and then the customs union, we have the single market, and then so on and so forth. So we have the EU as the complete figure of regional integration. But now, in order to have that, you need a homogeneous environment. So ASEAN as a heterogeneous that is actually quite heterogeneous by nature, is actually serving another way to form regionalism, which is actually trade integration. We are not actually compromising with the non-trade integration, especially a single market and so on and so forth, but we are only trying to focus more on trade integration, as it is actually quite very much expected by the XR-OLID model, which is actually the differences in resource endowment is actually serving as the good basis of trade and trade integration. So we have that as our fundamentals, because you see ASEAN is quite heterogeneous in having a heterogeneous environment. If you see from the Global Competitiveness Index, for example, we have Singapore, one of the best country in the world in terms of competitiveness, but we have also some of the countries just like of Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, that is actually not even in the ranking. So we have the most completely heterogeneous environment. So in order to have a regionalization in progress, we need to focus more on trade. So in order to progress more, with that in mind, with heterogeneous environment in mind, so we need several factors to progress in regional trade integration within ASEAN and ASEAN Plus. So those factors coming from several of my empirical findings are infrastructure, because we need good infrastructure to connect, to serve as the connectivity between ASEAN member countries and also the ASEAN Plus countries. Infrastructure is actually quite very much serving as the multiplier effect for the economy. Next is actually good tax incentives. So fiscal incentives is very much focal point, creating as a focal point for the whole economy to progress more in order to comply with regionalism and regionalization. Another thing is actually when it comes to democracy and institution. So institution is actually quite very much relevant nowadays, because without a proper institution, we will have volatility in consumption, we will have volatility in growth, which is not good as our fundamentals in the future. So most of the institutions are actually what coincides with the World Governance Index, that is coming from the control of corruption, voice and accountability, regulatory equality, government effectiveness, and then a rule of law. So those several institutional points is actually quite relevant, and it's actually quite important in order to consider the regionalism process in the future. Not to mention that we need also a good and quality labor force. So the labor force itself needs to be increased considerably, especially when it comes to Indonesia. Indonesia itself, when you see the data of productivity in the labor force on the manufacturing sector. In the manufacturing sector, labor force in the manufacturing sector, the growth of productivity in the manufacturing sector in terms of labor force is about 2% or 3% at most. But you see, when it comes to wage, is more than 10%. Previously, it's more than 10%. One of the worst is actually about 30%. But nowadays, is about 8 to 10% given the new formula of wage. But again, this still creates a huge gap. Yeah, if you see the productivity level is 2 or 3%, but if you see the wage growth is about 8%. Even we have the so-called new formula of wage. This is clearly still not enough. So a rule of thumb is if you have a productivity level about 2 or 3%, so the rule of thumb will be twice than the productivity. So it's about 60%. So 8% to 10% is still costly. So when it comes to Indonesia, this will create the investment diversion. What is investment diversion? The investment will divert to other countries. So this is clearly not the result that we are going to see in the future if we actually, Indonesia is trying the best to increase the level productivity in the labor force. So, I think there is enough to wrap up regionalization towards regionalism. As a brief overview, we need a regionalism in the future as opposed to regionalization, because regionalization, as I mentioned earlier, is just a market-driven process that offers you no sustainability in the future. So in the future, we need regionalism. So ASEAN as the focus, ASEAN as the focal point. Nowadays you have ASEAN creating as an important hub of ASEAN Plus. We are going to TPP, we are going to the FTAP, and so on and so forth. So ASEAN way. So we need to create a more integrated environment, a more fundamental environment that's serving as a basis of regionalism. Okay, thank you.